We saw in the very opening scene of the scripture that God created everything, everything is good, but then we, humanity, we made an absolute disaster of the good that God created. We rebelled against him, and our rebellion against him has brought deep implications into the world. I remember when my wife and I, Kay, were first married, everything was blissful, and then a couple of weeks into the marriage, she had this dream of some things that I did to her in the dream, some hurtful words that I said, and so she wanted to talk to me the next morning about her dream. And we got married so young, I was like, what? How can I be accountable for what I did in the dream? But basically, our marriage, we could tell right off the bat, wasn't going to be perfect at all times, because we have such deep implications of this world being broken that I even do things in somebody's dream. I mean, things are just not perfect in this world any longer because of our rebellion against God. So you see, and as the story of God unfolds, that after Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden, things don't get better at all. In fact, their first kid, Cain, kills his brother Abel. And so as you read through the scripture, after the Garden of Eden, things get progressively worse. Yet, when we remember back to that very first scene in the garden, we see that God promised with hope that he was not going to forsake his people, that he was one day going to redeem everything through the sacrifice of Jesus, born of a woman. We see that God promises not to give up on us. And that's what season 2 or session 2 is all about. The promise of God and the promise of God to bring a people to himself. Here's what we're going to see. God pursues Abraham, a man from an idol-worshiping family who has no children with his wife, and promises that he will be the father of many nations. God promises land to Abraham and assures him that all nations will be blessed through his offspring. God continues to be faithful to his family. He restates the promise to Abraham's son, Isaac, and grandson, Jacob, who is renamed Israel. A famine strikes the promised land, so Jacob and the family move to Egypt, where one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, is already there to provide for the family. That's what you're going to see, God promising to a family. And what does this mean for you? What does the promise of God to a specific family, what does this matter to you? Blaise Pascal was a famous mathematician, still known as one of the most famous mathematicians ever. He, before he became a Christian, sought satisfaction in the things of this world and his intellect and being perceived as an influential person. But one day he met Jesus. In fact, we know exactly when it took place because he wrote the date down and had these words sewn inside of his jacket. This is how he became a Christian. From about 10:30 at night to about half an hour past midnight, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Not of philosophers and scholars. Certitude, heartfelt joy, peace. God of Jesus Christ, God of Jesus Christ. The world forgotten, everything except God. O righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you. Joy, 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 tears of joy. Blaise Pascal had an encounter with God that changed everything about him. But notice in that encounter he had with God, he understood that the God he started to worship, the God who changed his whole life, is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you have believed in Jesus, if you have become a Christian, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is your God too. In fact, your faith is really connected to this family more than you perhaps have realized, because this family is how God is going to keep his promise to crush the head of Satan, to clothe you in all of his forgiveness. Your faith is so deeply woven into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to understand the story of God, you've got to understand this family. And so this is going to be kind of quick, but I want to give you an overview of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, you see God pursue this guy. His name's Abram at first. His name later is changed to Abraham. God pursues Abram to be his own. Now, Abram was not someone who you would expect to be the father of many people or the father of many nations, which is what God calls him. Because Abram's dad was an idol worshiper, because Abram and his wife, Sarah, have been unable to have a kid, but God often chooses the least likely, what some would say the most unlikely, to accomplish his purposes. Maybe you have felt at times in your life, I'm unlikely for God to use me. God is very attracted to our weaknesses. Look at this promise that God gives Abram. Genesis chapter 12, 1-3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God pursues Abraham. Abraham leaves. God's made this massive promise to Abraham. And then there's this covenant ceremony in Genesis chapter 15. And in this ceremony, Abram sleeps. All he does is sleep. Now, to understand this ceremony, you have to understand that in the ancient culture, when two people would go into an agreement with one another, they'd make this covenant, and they would actually sacrifice animals, cut the animals into pieces, and spread the animal pieces out. They would then walk through the animal pieces together, arm in arm, essentially saying, I promise to keep my end of the covenant, and if I don't, may what happened to these animals happen to me. That was essentially how they signed an agreement, how they signed a covenant. So God has made this promise to Abram, and now it's the covenant ceremony, and there are animals that have been sacrificed and spread apart. And if you're an ancient reader, you expect God and Abram to walk through this ceremony together, but Abram is asleep. In fact, notice what Genesis 15 says. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. So when you read the whole passage, you see that God walks through the sacrifices alone. Abram is on the side sleeping. Now, what is this meaning? This is meaning that God is taking full responsibility for his promise to Abram. That Abram really is not doing any of the work, that God is the one who's doing all of the work. God promises that Abram's going to be the father of many nations. Abram now is almost 100 years old, though, and he doesn't have a child with his wife, Sarah. So even though God has stated this promise, has done this covenant commitment where God alone walks through the sacrifices, Abram, like us, is thinking, is this really going to happen? I'm almost 100, and I don't have a child yet with my wife. In fact, notice in Genesis 17, verse 17, Abram actually laughs when God tells him he's going to be a father. Abraham fell face down, so God has changed his name to Abraham at this point. Then he laughed. This is when God told him he would be a father again, and said to himself, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? And so they wrestled to even believe God. But God always keeps his promises. You get further in the story, Genesis chapter 21, the Lord came to Sarah, and as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah born to him, Isaac. Isaac actually means he laughs. So God is able to take the laughing of doubt. Abram laughed because there's no way I can be the father of a nation. I can't even be the father of one. Turned the laughing of doubt to laughing of joy because God keeps his promises. God pursued this man from an idol-worshiping family who couldn't have a kid and promised that from his offspring, all nations will be blessed. And he has a son named Isaac. Now, your faith is connected to Abraham and Isaac. Now, the story of Abraham and Isaac, or their account, is one of the most famous accounts in the Old Testament, and it's a jarring story. Now, Abraham has longed for this son, and God then asked Abraham to sacrifice his son. Now, why would God ask Abraham to do this? He's probably perplexed, surely, by this request, but in some sense, this made sense to Abraham because in this culture, the firstborn son would receive the blessing from the family, the inheritance from the family, but also the sins from the family, or the punishment that the family deserved could be placed on the firstborn son. And Abraham knows he has oftentimes not believed God, oftentimes not been the man that he should be. And so God is just to ask there to be a sacrifice for all of my sins, Abraham is thinking. But Abraham's also thinking, he's been so good. God has been so good and so gracious to me. Surely he's going to come through. And so when God commands Abraham to take his only son Isaac to a place where he will be sacrificed, the story is just riveting. Notice what the scripture says. Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the two of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." He replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Abraham displayed great faith here, believing that God is just, that sin can be paid for, but there's going to be some other way. There's going to be some other way so that my son's not slaughtered. In fact, when you read in the New Testament, you read in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham believed that even if Isaac died, that God would some kind of way bring him back from the dead. Abraham was holding on to two truths, that God is going to be just, that sin is going to be punished, but he's going to keep his promises. He's going to continue to be good and gracious to me. And God provided a sacrifice so that Isaac would not be sacrificed. And on that mountain, it is said, the Lord will provide. This has huge implications for you, because in those same mountains, that's the place where years later, God the Son, Jesus, enters this world, and he is the sacrifice so that you and I aren't paying the price of our sin in our flesh. Jesus pays the price of our sin in his flesh when he is crucified on the cross. And as Jesus is on the cross, there is no voice from heaven saying, "Stop, stop, stop." Jesus is sacrificed, and as he dies on the cross for us, he yells out, "It is finished." The sacrifice was completed in Jesus on our behalf. And so we see that the account of Abraham and Isaac, it points us to Jesus. It points us to Jesus. Jesus carried the wood, just like Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice. Jesus was actually, though, executed, killed, crucified on the cross for us in our place, with no voice from heaven saying stop. And because of the sacrifice of Jesus, we are now brought into this family the family the promise was made to, Abraham, Isaac. In fact, notice that God repeated the promise to Isaac. Genesis 26, verse 4, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring. So in the book of Genesis, God keeps repeating his promise to this family, Abraham, now Abraham and Isaac. And now we look at the third in the family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob is the son of Isaac and his wife. Now, Jacob was not the firstborn. He actually came out of the womb second to his brother Esau. But one day, Jacob had his brother sell him his birthright for a cup of stew because Esau was so hungry. He sold being the firstborn and all the privileges of being the firstborn for a cup of stew. And then later, Jacob actually deceives his father Isaac as Isaac is on his deathbed. See, Isaac loved Esau, the one who's out in the woods hunting all the time. He loved him more than Jacob. And so Jacob, the deceiver, dresses up and puts smelly stuff on him to smell like Esau while his father's on his deathbed. And he goes to his father, and his father blesses him, gives him the promise of being the firstborn. And so Jacob steals essentially the birthright, the blessing from his father. Now, Esau is livid, of course, and so Jacob knows that he must flee. So Jacob runs away from the home. He's the secondborn, but he's now essentially the firstborn because he's taken the birthright from his brother Esau, and he leaves his father's home. He goes into the wilderness, and then at a moment in the wilderness, God comes to him and repeats the promise that all the nations are going to be blessed through this family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, in fact, look at the scripture with me. This is Genesis chapter 28, verse 12 through 15. As Jacob was there, as he dreamed, he was laying on the ground, he goes into his sleep, and as he dreamed, a stairway was set on the ground with its top reaching the sky, and God's angels were going up and down on it. The Lord was standing there beside him, saying, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out toward the west, the east, the north, the south. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Look, I am with you, and will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So God, once again, is repeating his promise to this family. And in this encounter with God, there is this stairway to heaven where God descends to be with Jacob. Years later, when Jesus comes, Jesus reminds us that he is the staircase, that we could not climb our way to him. There was a group of Babylonians in Genesis chapter 11 before God makes the promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 11, they were trying to build this massive tower to climb their way to God. But you can't build a tower to climb to God. So now you get to this family, the family that God makes a promise to. And Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham, has the promise restated to him. But here it is. It's a ladder. It's God descending on the ladder. We can't work our way to him. He comes here to be with us. Jesus calls himself the ladder, the one who descends to come and be with us. The only way that we can have a relationship with God is through Jesus. And so you see, your faith is deeply connected to this family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Because a promise was continually stated to them that their offspring would be from all of the nations. And how does that happen? Because from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob comes Jesus. And Jesus rescues people for himself from every single tribe, tongue, and nation. You are now a part if you have believed in Jesus, you are a part of this family of faith. In fact, the scripture says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. You're an heir of this promise. See, you are like Abraham in that all you did to become a son, a daughter of God was sleep. That God did all the work. That God walked through the promise. He walked through the covenant promise. And that on the cross, Jesus did absorb in his own flesh all of the times that we broke our promises to him. All we did was sleep. All we did was sleep on the side. And God has made us his own, just like he made Abraham his own. Just as Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, Jesus is the one who's ultimately sacrificed for us to make us God's. And just as God came down to be with Jacob, God has come down to be with us. Jesus descended here, and he is the fulfillment of the promise that was given to this family. And we now have the same faith of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because from their lineage came Jesus, the one who makes us blessed, the one who makes people from every single tribe, tongue, and nation eternally happy. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise.